You hear Vikings and you think warriors, longships, raids, but there's a whole other story buried in the sagas and scratched into the bone. The women they brought back, the ones who weren't wives but lived as wives, the ones called frilla, concubines. Second choices, lower status. And what happened to them sits in mass graves and genetic markers and Arabic eyewitness accounts that make your skin crawl. This isn't legend. This is what the sources say. This is what the ground gave up. So what did Vikings actually do to young women taken as second wives? And why does the truth look worse than death? If you value documented Viking and medieval history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. Also, this script is researched and factual, using sources from the Cambridge Archaeological Journal published May 2021 on human sacrifice and gendered narratives, and from Ben Raffield's April 2019 peer-reviewed study in slavery and abolition on the slave markets of the Viking world, deep academic sources with archaeological cross-reference, not popular retellings. Now back to the information. Let's start with the word itself. Frilla, Old Norse. It means concubine or mistress, but their reality was messier. In Viking Age Scandinavia, from roughly 750 to 1050 CE, powerful men kept multiple women. One wife, legal, respected. Then friller, plural. These women lived in the household, bore children. Had some rights under law, but fewer than wives. The Icelandic Gragas laws mention them almost in passing. The Sturlunga saga from the 13th century looking back says, almost universally, men indulged in extramarital affairs with numbers of women. Not hidden, open, institutionalized. Who were they? Slaves at first, thralls captured in raids. The Annals of Ulster from 821 describe Vikings near Dublin carrying off a great number of women into captivity. Just women. Targeted. The slave trade ran through Dublin, Hedeby in Denmark, Birka in Sweden. Archaeological digs found iron collars and shackles at all three sites. 4 examples at Birka, 6 at Hedeby, 1 confirmed at Dublin. Ben Raffield's 2019 analysis argues these weren't for animals. They're too close to the harbor districts. Too similar to human restraints from other eras, they cluster where the markets were. Now, price, hard to pin exact numbers because most deals left no receipt, but context helps. Ibn Hawqal, writing in 977 CE, describes a Viking slave trade stretching from Spain to Egypt across the Mediterranean. Slaves were commodity. One estimate says 10% of the Viking Age Scandinavian population were thralls. 10%, that's not fringe, that's structural. And women were valued differently. Younger, fertile, foreign. The term used in some Irish sources is women from over the Great Sea, foreigners who do not know Irish, easy to control, hard to run. Iceland's settlement between 870 and 930 CE gives us numbers in another way. Genetic studies, multiple. A 2001 study in the American Journal of Human Genetics analyzed mitochondrial DNA from 401 Icelanders and over 2,500 Europeans. Mitochondrial DNA passes mother to child only. Result, 60% of Iceland's founding female population came from the British Isles. Not Scandinavia, 60%. But Y chromosome studies published September the same year show 80% of Icelandic men descended from Norse fathers. The math is brutal. Norsemen sailed with British and Irish women, not as wives, as captives, as friller. A 2018 study in Science Journal pushed further. Researchers at Decode Genetics in Reykjavik sequenced DNA from 25 ancient Icelanders buried across the island. Their remains split roughly even. Norse and Gaelic ancestry mixed, but modern Icelanders, 70% Norse genes. 1,100 years and the Gaelic contribution faded. Why? Archaeologist Suna Ebeneser's suggests those with more Gaelic blood, often enslaved when they arrived, had lower reproductive success, or they died faster, or their children didn't survive. The population corrected toward the dominant group. Genetic drift with a social engine, the enslaved left fewer descendants because their conditions were worse. Now let's talk about how they got there. Raids weren't random, they targeted women. The Annals of Ulster, again, 821. Near Dublin, great number of women. Not great number of people. Women. Specific. This wasn't collateral damage. This was the point. Viking crews needed labor back home. They needed textile workers. Sail making alone was massive. Estimates say one sail for a longship required 5 years of one person's labor if done alone. Sheep pasture, wool production, spinning, weaving, labor intensive. Slave labor solved it. But they also needed something else. Partners. The genetic evidence from Iceland makes that clear. Norsemen at the top controlled access to wives. Monogamous marriage was common for the middle and lower classes, but the elite, different rules. Adam of Bremen, writing around 1075 CE, describes the Norwegian court and says rich and powerful Viking men tended to have many wives and concubines. This created a shortage. If the top tier men held multiple women, the bottom tier men had none. So what happens? They raid, they take... It's not just wealth, it's access to women. Some historians argue the Viking expansion itself, the whole raiding phenomenon, was driven partly by this imbalance. Young men with no marriage prospects turned violent and expansionist. Now enter the frilla as institution. By the late Viking age, concubinage wasn't hidden, it had legal contours. A frilla could be freed. Her children could inherit, though less than legitimate children. An Icelandic folk, saying goes, better a good man's friller than married badly. That's cold comfort, but it shows negotiation. Some women chose it, or at least accepted it as better than alternatives. A concubine of a powerful man had status, protection. Her kin could benefit, but the choice? How free was it really? Here's the clearest picture we have. Ibn Fadlan, Arab diplomat traveling north from Baghdad in 921 CE. He reaches the Volga River in 922. Meets a group called the Rus, Swedish or Swedish-descended Vikings. He watches them for weeks, takes notes. Then a chieftain dies. Ibn Fadlan witnesses the funeral. 10 days of preparation, and a slave woman volunteers to die with her master. Volunteers. That's the word. But watch what happens. The woman is asked. She says yes. Immediately, 2 other slave women are assigned to her. They follow her everywhere. They wash her feet with their own hands. She's dressed in fine clothes, given alcohol constantly. She drinks and sings every day. For 10 days, she's told she'll see the afterlife. She's told she'll reunite with her master and her own dead family. She's kept happy, kept drunk. On the final day, the funeral ship is prepared. The dead chieftain is dressed and placed on the ship. Then animals are sacrificed. A dog, 2 horses, 2 cows, a rooster, a hen, all cut in half, placed on the ship. Then the woman, she's brought to the ship. 6 men enter the pavilion with her. They have sex with her, all 6, one after another. Ibn Fadlan describes it coldly. Each man says, "Now I have done this out of love for my lord." Then she's given more alcohol. She's walked around. She enters a doorframe 3 times. Each time she says she sees her family. She sees her master. She sees paradise. Then she's taken into the pavilion on the ship. An old woman called the Angel of Death follows. The men outside start banging shields with sticks, loud, to cover any sound from inside. 2 men hold her feet. 2 hold her hands. The Angel of Death wraps a rope around her neck. 2 more men pull it tight from opposite sides. And while she's being strangled, the old woman stabs her repeatedly with a broad dagger, between the ribs. In the chest, quick but not instant. Then she's laid next to her master. The ship is set on fire. Everything burns. Ibn Fadlan wrote it down. The account survives in multiple manuscript traditions. It's corroborated in type, if not detail, by Norse sagas mentioning funeral sacrifices. And archaeology backs it up. Graves across Scandinavia show it. Multiple bodies. One high status, others low status. Decapitated. Different diets based on bone analysis. A 2013 burial at Flakstad, Norway. Several bodies, some headless. Isotope analysis of teeth and bones showed the decapitated individuals ate simple seafood diets. The others ate meat and dairy, thralls and masters. The headless ones were sacrificed. Elise Naumann from University of Oslo in 2013 proposed these were grave goods. Human grave goods. That's not isolated. Other double and triple burials across Norway and Sweden show the same pattern. Oseberg ship burial from 834 CE. 2 women, 1 high status, rich grave goods, the other, lower status, possibly sacrificed. The exact relationship is debated, but the pattern repeats. When powerful men died, someone went with them. Often women, often slaves. The term for it in Old Norse is hard to pin because the sagas use euphemism, but the concept is clear. The dead need servants in the afterlife. Now, let's be precise. Not every frilla died at a funeral. Most lived. But they lived under what conditions? This is where it gets harder because slaves don't leave records. But we have fragments, legal codes, saga mentions. The Icelandic law code Gragas has almost nothing on concubines. But the sagas, especially Sturlunga and the bishops' sagas from the 12th and 13th centuries, mention them constantly. One scholar writing in the 1980s noted, "It's scarcely possible to read these sagas without noticing Concubinage was the national custom during the Icelandic Free State period from 930 to 1262 CE. What were the rules? A man couldn't bring a frilla into his household without his wife's permission. If he did, the wife could strike the concubine, even kill her. No legal penalty. The wife held authority over the household. The frilla had to submit. If the wife tolerated her, the frilla had a place, but precarious. Some frilla came from equal or near equal social standing. By the 11th century, when slavery was declining in Scandinavia, men still kept frilla, but these were free women now, often from poorer families. A chieftain taking a frilla from a lower status family could elevate that family's position. The family gained a connection to power. The woman gained material security, but unequal leverage. There's a darker case. Earl Håkon Sigurdsson of Lade, Norwegian Jarl ruling from about 975 to 995 CE. Multiple sources describe him. Snorri Sturluson, writing in Heimskringla around 1230 CE, says Hakon had the daughters of powerful men taken and brought home to him. He slept with them for a week or two, then sent them home. This got him much dislike from the kinsmen of the women. Adam of Bremen, writing closer to Hakon's time around 1075 CE, gives it harder. He implies Hakon ordered subjects to send their daughters to him, forced, not requested. The term used is ordered. Daughters of nobles, daughters of commoners, taken, used, returned. Some historians link this to fertility cult practices, worship of Thorgerdr Holgabrud, a Norse deity, maybe ritual, maybe just power. But the sagas are clear, Håkon was hated for it. He was killed in 995 by his own slave Kark, hiding in a pigsty. His head was cut off and stuck on a stake at Munkholmen, where people spat at it. The sources call him Håkon the Bad, Håkon Illi, not for military failure. For this, children born to frillur had inheritance rights, but limited. Legal texts say they could be recognized by the father. If he acknowledged them, they were legitimate-ish. They could inherit movable property, sometimes land if there were no other heirs. But they ranked below children born in marriage. A wife's sons inherited first, always. A frilla's son got what was left, if anything. And daughters? Even less. A free woman could inherit from her father in the absence of sons. But a frilla's daughter? The law is murky there. Probably very little. Daily life? We have scraps. Sagas describe frillur weaving, cooking, domestic work. Some managed households when the main wife was absent. Some were trusted, but they weren't protected the way wives were. A wife who was struck by her husband for anything other than 3 specific offenses, giving away something not hers, being found with another man, or cursing his beard, could demand payment. A frilla, no such protection. She could be beaten, used, discarded. Her legal recourse was nearly zero. Sexual availability was expected. Ibn Fadlan's account mentions it in passing. The Rus had slave girls for trading. One man will have intercourse with his slave girl while his companion looks on. Public, casual, no privacy. In the funeral account, the woman was required to sleep with multiple men during the 10 days before her death. The text says she was forced to do so with most of the Rus men that participated in the ceremony. Ritual or not, that's rape, serial rape, sanctioned, witnessed. The term bed slave appears in multiple sources, Ahmad ibn Fadlan and later saga references. A bed slave is exactly what it sounds like. A woman kept specifically for sexual access. No other role, or that's the primary role. Norsemen also kept bed slaves. These unfortunate women had little choice in whether or not they lay with their master. Quote from the historical sources. Little choice. Not no choice. Little. The phrasing is bleak. It acknowledges the reality without naming it fully. Rape as institution. And then there's the sacrifice question. How common was it? We don't know. Ibn Fadlan saw one funeral. He describes it as though it's normal for them, but he's writing for an Arab audience and playing up the exotic. The Rus tell him they're confused why Arabs bury their dead instead of burning them quickly so they go to paradise fast. Cultural relativism. Both sides think the other is barbaric, but the archaeological record has examples. Not hundreds, not thousands, but enough to show it happened. Enough to show it was a recognized practice. When a high-status man died, a woman might die too. Volunteer or force the line blurs under social pressure. The Cambridge Archaeological Journal published a paper in May 2021 by scholars examining social agency and gendered narratives of human sacrifice in the Viking Age. They argue we should stop automatically assuming the slave woman had no agency. They point out she's described as elevated during the 10 days, given fine clothes, authority over other slaves, allowed to command. They suggest maybe she saw it as an honor. Maybe she believed in the afterlife promise. Maybe her family benefited afterward. Possible. But then they also note the sexual violence, the coercion, the 2 women assigned to make sure she didn't run. and they conclude agency exists on a spectrum. She made a choice within a system that left her almost no good options. That's not freedom, that's navigating captivity. Let's zoom out. Why did this system exist? Power, economics, demographics, but also ideology. The Norse believed in an afterlife, Valhalla for warriors, other halls for others. The dead needed goods, food, weapons, animals, and servants. If you're powerful in life, you expect to be powerful in death. So you take your household with you, or parts of it. Slavery in the afterlife. The logic is brutal but consistent, and it worked because slavery worked. 10% of the population. That's structural dependence. Thralls built the long houses, worked the fields, made the sails, cooked the food, bore the children who became more thralls. It's a system that reproduces itself. And women especially were targeted because they were reproductive. A male slave can work. A female slave can work and produce more slaves. The economic logic is cold. Now the transition. By the 11th century, slavery starts declining in Scandinavia. Christianization, economic shifts. But concubinage doesn't end. It shifts. Free women become friller. The word stays. The practice continues, but now it's voluntary. Sort of. A poor family with a daughter. A rich man offers. The family gets connection. The daughter gets fed and clothed. Maybe her children inherit something. Maybe not. It's still unequal, but it's not slavery. That distinction matters. But the vulnerability remains. A frilla without slave status could leave. In theory. But leave to what? Back to poverty? With a child? Stigmatized? The structural coercion is different, but still real. The sagas tell us some friller held real power, especially older ones. Women who survived their childbearing years. Women whose children grew up and succeeded. Women who outlived their men and controlled property. The sagas mention women like Hildegunr in Njal's saga, who incites Flosi to avenge her husband's killing. Thorgerd in Laxdela saga, who shames her sons into avenging their brother. Powerful women, post-reproductive, unthreatening to the patriarchal structure now, so they're allowed more freedom. The pattern is consistent. Young women are controlled, older women are freed. Once they can't destabilize the family through pregnancy or marriage alliances, they can act. But the young friller, controlled. Watch the household archaeology. Some Norse households show segregated spaces, possible women's quarters, weaving rooms. Jockin's writing in 1991 points to possible seclusion of women in certain parts of the house. Men's access limited. This might have been for wives, might have been for friller too. Controlling space controls behavior. You can't run if you don't leave the room. The genetic data circles back. That Icelandic founding population. 60% of the women from the British Isles, but over 11 centuries, those lineages faded. Now it's 30% in modern Icelanders. The Gaelic contribution was bred out, or died out. Why? The Cambridge study from 2021 proposes differential reproductive success. If Frelur and their children had fewer resources, they had higher mortality. If they were lower status, they married lower status. If they were marginalized, their children were marginalized. Over generations, the population shifts. The Norse contribution dominates because Norse families had structural advantages. But here's the twist. The genetic legacy persists in other populations. Studies of mitochondrial DNA in the Orkney Islands show 35% Norse origin. Shetland similar, Western Isles 12%. And Norway itself, modern Norwegians share closer genetic ties to ancient Icelanders than modern Icelanders do, because the Icelandic population underwent genetic drift in isolation. Small population, island, genetic diversity dropped. But Norway stayed connected to broader Europe. More migration, more mixing, more preservation of the original Viking Age diversity. So if you want to know what early Viking genetics looked like, check modern Norway and Scotland, not just Iceland, now the other slave markets. Dublin operated for over 3 centuries, from the late 8th century to the Norman invasion in 1170 CE. It was a hub. The Irish fought each other, captured enemies, sold them to Vikings. Vikings raided Britain, brought captives to Dublin, sold them onward to Spain and the Islamic world and Byzantium. Silver dirhams from the Abbasid Caliphate show up in hordes across Scandinavia. Proof of trade. Slaves went south. Silver came north. Dublin was the fulcrum. Hedeby in Denmark. Major trading center from the 8th to 11th centuries, mentioned in multiple sources. A monk visiting in 870 CE was so shocked at seeing Christian slaves for sale, he sold all his possessions and bought them freedom. That story is recorded, meaning it was notable, meaning it happened enough that one monk's gesture stood out. The slave market there was open, legal, regulated. Elites monitored it, maybe taxed it. The 9th century Vida Ansgari describes burqa in Sweden administered by a royal bailiff who managed economic and defense functions. Trade happened under supervision, including slave trade. How many women? We'll never know. The written sources give anecdotes. The archaeology gives fragments. But the scale? Ibn Haqwal, in 977, says the trade stretched from Spain to Egypt. That's not small. That's an industry. And women were premium goods, younger, fertile. Foreign women from over the Great Sea, sold in Dublin, shipped to Hedabai, traded to Bulgar on the Volga, then caravanned south through Khorazm to Samanid markets in Central Asia, then to Persia, then to Baghdad. Long supply chains, high value, high volume, and their lives. Most left no trace, no name, no grave. The ones we know because they died dramatically. Ibn Fadlan's slave woman, the decapitated bodies in Flakstad, the double burials at Oseberg. But the thousands who lived and died in obscurity? Gone. Slaves don't get marked graves. They don't get sagas. They don't get runestones. They're archaeologically invisible. Ben Raffield's 2019. Study calls slavery in the Viking Age an invisible archaeology. We know it happened. We have some evidence. But the record is sparse because the people who suffered it had no power to record it. That's the cruelty stacked on cruelty. Not just the violence, not just the coercion, but the erasure, taken from home, enslaved, used, discarded, forgotten. Your children might inherit something if your master acknowledges them. Might. But you're a footnote, a genetic trace, a corroded iron collar in a museum drawer. Let's go back to Earl Hakon, 995 CE. He's hiding from Olaf Tryggvason, who's conquering Norway and Christianizing it by force. Hakon's pagan, powerful, hated. He and his slave Kark hide in a pigsty under a stone. Olaf arrives at the farm, gives a speech, offers a reward for whoever kills Hakon. That night, Kark cuts Hakon's head off, brings it to Olaf, expecting payment. Olaf refuses, says a slave shouldn't kill his master. Cuts Kark's head off too. Both heads go on stakes at Munkholmen. People spit on them. Hakon's because of his crimes. Kark's because he was a slave who overstepped. Even in death, the hierarchy holds. But think about Kark. He lived his whole life under Hakon, watched Hakon take women, watched him send them back. Maybe Kark had a daughter. Maybe Hakon took her. The sources don't say, but when Kark gets the chance, he kills him. Risk his own life. Knows he might die. Does it anyway. That tells you something about what it was like to live under Hakon. And Hakon wasn't unique. The sources call him Hakon the Bad, but they describe his behavior as typical for powerful men. Just more extreme, more hated. But Adam of Bremen, writing about the general Norwegian elite, says they tended to have many wives and concubines. Tended, meaning common, meaning normal. Hakon was the bad example of a normal practice. So what's the answer? What did Vikings do to young women taken as second wives that was worse than death? Here's what we know. They enslaved them, took them from their homes, transported them hundreds or thousands of miles, sold them in markets, brought them into households where they had no legal protection, required sexual availability, beat them if they disobeyed, gave them no recourse, let the wife kill them if the wife wanted, had their children but gave those children fewer rights, and sometimes, when the master died, they killed the concubine too. Strangled her and stabbed her and burned her with the corpse, told her it was an honor, made her drunk so she'd comply, covered her screams with shields. That's documented. That's in Ibn Fadlan. That's in the graves. And for the ones who weren't killed? They lived in a state of permanent vulnerability. A Frilla could be freed, but most weren't. A Frilla could gain status, but only through her master's favor. A Frilla could have children, but those children ranked below legitimate ones. She could be discarded, replaced, forgotten. Her genetic line might fade over generations because her descendants had fewer resources, or she might be sacrificed, one or the other. Neither is good. So worse than death? For some, yes, because death is one event. This was a lifetime, or lifetimes, generations. Women taken in 821 near Dublin, their daughters born into slavery, their granddaughters born into it, until the system shifted in the 11th century. That's 200 years, 10 generations. And even after slavery declined, concubinage continued. Different structure. Same vulnerability. The worst part, it was legal, it was normal, it was institutional. Not hidden, not shameful. Adam of Bremen describes it. Ibn Fadlan describes it. The sagas describe it. The law codes accommodate it. No one writing these sources says this is wrong. They describe it as fact, as practice, as the way things are. The only time someone gets criticized is when they overdo it like Hakon, or when they disrupt the social order. But the system itself, unchallenged. Even the Christians who replaced the pagan Norse didn't fully end it. Concubinage persisted in Christianized Scandinavia into the 13th century. The Sturlunga saga, written in the 13th century, records it as ongoing. The church opposed it officially, but in practice, powerful men kept doing it, dressed it up, called it different things. But the structure remained. High-status men with multiple women, low-status women with no options. That's the legacy. And the genetic trace, it's still there. 60% of Icelandic women in 930 CE from the British Isles, 30% now. But in Orkney, in Shetland, in parts of Scotland, the Norse genetic contribution is visible and persistent. Those populations descend partly from Viking men and Celtic women. Whether those women came willingly or not, the sources suggest not. The Annals of Ulster say a great number of women carried off. Carried. Not invited. Carried. That's the language of abduction. DNA studies published in 2018 by the Irish Post and Science Journal confirm thousands of slaves, mostly women, were transported from Ireland and Scotland to Iceland in the 9th and 10th centuries. Thousands, not dozens. Thousands. That's not raiding for ransom. That's systematic extraction of human resources. And the ones who survived the journey faced what? Life as a frilla? Life as a bed slave? Life in a household where the wife could kill you? Life waiting to see if your master dies and takes you with him. Now here's the final evidence that reframes everything. In 2021, researchers published findings from burial analysis across Iceland. They found something unexpected. Some women who were clearly of Gaelic origin based on DNA were buried in full Norse style. Boat burials, grave goods, high status markers, meaning what? Meaning some friller or their children climbed? Meaning some enslaved women or their descendants gained enough status to be buried like Norse. The genetic data shows they started as Gaelic, probably captured, probably enslaved. But over time, or through their children, they assimilated, or their children did. But here's the coldness. For every one woman buried high status, how many died in unmarked graves? For every one child who inherited and climbed, how many were ignored? The exceptions prove the rule. If we're noting the rare cases where Gaelic women were buried with honors, that means most weren't. Most vanished. Most became the invisible archaeology, and that's the final answer. What Vikings did to young women taken as second wives was create a permanent underclass. They built a system where women had no leverage, where violence was legal, where death was possible, where survival meant submission, where children meant maybe a path up for the next generation, but maybe not. It was structural. It was sustained. It was worse than a single death because it was many small deaths over many years. Autonomy gone, home gone, language gone, family gone, future uncertain. And through it all, the knowledge that you're replaceable. That if you anger the wife or the master or the household, you can be struck down with no consequence. That's the reality the sources describe. The iron collars in Dublin and Hedeby and Burka. The genetic studies showing Gaelic women in Iceland. The decapitated bodies in Norwegian graves. The eyewitness account of a slave woman strangled and stabbed while men banged shields to cover the sound. The saga descriptions of Earl Haakon taking daughters for a week or two. The legal codes giving friller limited rights. The demographic evidence of young Norse men raiding for access to women. All of it points the same way. This was a system. This was sustained. This was what they did. And the frilla who navigated it. Who kept her head down and bore children and hoped they'd have better. Who lived to old age and maybe controlled property after the master died. She was lucky. She survived. But survival under those conditions isn't victory. It's just survival. And for the ones sacrificed, like Ibn Fadlan described, they were told it was an honor. They were told they'd see paradise. They were kept drunk for 10 days and then killed. That's not honor. That's managed compliance. So worse than death? For some of them, yes, because death ends. This didn't. This followed bloodlines. This followed genetic traces. This followed lineages through 1100 years until researchers in 2018 could sequence DNA and say, yes, these women came from the British Isles as captives, and their contribution faded because their descendants had fewer resources. That's the long echo of what Vikings did to young women taken as second wives. Not just violence, not just death, but erasure over generations. That's worse. Let's descend deeper. We've mapped the geography of this brutality, from the Irish coast to the funeral pyres on the Volga River. We have the genetics, the shackles, the eyewitness accounts. But what we've discussed is the system's architecture. Now we need to walk the halls of the Longhouse. We need to understand the daily terror, the subtle wars fought between women, and the impossible choices faced by the children born from the system. Because the horror of the frilla wasn't just in the dramatic moments of sacrifice or abduction, it was in the grinding, unending reality of a life without leverage. Let's begin inside the household, with the legal wife. The husfreyja, the lady of the house. She held the keys to the stores. She managed the thralls. She was the mistress of the domestic sphere, a position of significant power and respect. Now, introduce the frilla into this space. Not a guest, not a servant in the traditional sense. She is a sexual rival, brought into the wife's domain, who will bear the husband children who might compete with the wife's own. The Icelandic law code, the Gragas, is chillingly clear on this point. If a man brought a concubine into the home without his wife's consent, the wife had the legal right to kill her, and she had 3 days to do it. After 3 days, if the frilla was still alive, the wife's right to violence was reduced. She could still strike her, but not kill her without penalty. Think about that. A 3-day window for murder, sanctioned by law. This wasn't an abstract legal principle. It was the codification of a brutal power dynamic. The wife's honor was tied to her exclusive control over the household. The frilla was a direct threat to that honor. While some wives may have tolerated or even welcomed an extra pair of hands for labor, the sagas are filled with the bitterness this arrangement created. The tension must have been constant, a war fought not with axes on a battlefield, but with poison, with whispers, with the strategic deployment of social shame. The frilla had to navigate this every day. Every meal, every task, was a test. Did she look at the husband for too long? Did she take a slightly better piece of bread? Any perceived slight could trigger the wife's legally protected wrath. Her survival depended on making herself as small, as unthreatening, as invisible as possible, while simultaneously remaining desirable to the man who owned her. It's a psychological tightrope walk over a pit of knives. Now consider the children. The frilusen or friludater. The children of the concubine. The first script noted their limited inheritance rights, but the reality was a social and legal limbo. Their status was entirely dependent on one thing: the father's acknowledgement. If he publicly claimed the child as his, the child had a name, a lineage, and some claim to property. If he did not, the child was nothing. A slave born of a slave, with no connection to the powerful man who sired them. This gave the father absolute power. He could create a dynasty, or he could create another thrall with a single word. For a child who was acknowledged, life was still a struggle. They were a constant, living reminder of the father's infidelity, a source of shame for the legal wife and her legitimate children. In the sagas, these children are often depicted as ambitious, resentful, and dangerous. They have something to prove. They fight harder, take greater risks, because they start from a disadvantage, and sometimes, against all odds, they succeeded. The most famous example is Magnus the Good, who became king of Norway and Denmark in the 11th century. He was the illegitimate son of King Olaf II and his English concubine, Alfhild. His path to the throne was paved with bloodshed and political maneuvering. He had to be better than his legitimate rivals, because his very origin was a stain against him. But for everyone, Magnus the Good, there were thousands of forgotten children of Friller who lived and died in the shadow of their legitimate half-siblings, never inheriting more than a token piece of property, always seen as second best. Their existence was a testament to the father's power, but also a constant source of instability within the family. Let's pivot from the social to the economic. We mentioned that enslaved women provided labor, but the scale of this labor, specifically textile production, was the engine of the entire Viking Age. A single sail for a longship. The vessel that enabled the raiding and trading Truro required an astronomical amount of work. It took the wool from over 400 sheep. That wool had to be sheared, cleaned, carded, spun into thread, dyed, and then woven on a warp-weighted loom. One estimate suggests this process for one sail would take one person working alone nearly 5 years. Now, multiply that by the hundreds, perhaps thousands, of longships in the Viking fleets. The demand for textiles was insatiable, and this work was done almost exclusively by women. In archaeological digs of longhouses, from Scandinavia to Iceland and Greenland, the most common artifacts found in the domestic spaces are spindle whorls and loom weights. They are everywhere. This tells us that weaving was a constant, central activity of the household. And who did the most laborious parts of this work? The thralls, the friller. Their hands spun the thread and wove the cloth that became the sails that carried Viking men across the seas to raid more villages and capture more women to bring back to spin and weave. It is a terrifying, self-perpetuating cycle. The enslaved women were forced to build the very machines of their own and others' oppression. Their labor was not incidental to the Viking Age. It was foundational. Without this massive, coerced workforce of female textile producers, the longships could not have sailed. The Viking expansion could not have happened on the scale that it did. And what happened to the women who didn't stay in Scandinavia? The first script mentioned the trade routes south. Let's follow a woman captured in a raid near Dublin. She is sold in the slave market there. She is not bought by a Norse chieftain to be a frilla in his longhouse. Instead, she's bought by a Rhodanite merchant. She is chained with others and put on a ship sailing for Al-Andalus, the Islamic-controlled Iberian Peninsula. From there, she might be sold in the markets of Cordoba, then one of the largest and most sophisticated cities in the world. Her life is no longer governed by the rhythms of the Norse seasons, but by the rules of a caliphate. She would likely be forced to convert to Islam. Her name would be changed. She would become a concubine in a harem, one of dozens or even hundreds of women owned by a single powerful man. Here, the dynamics are different. She is not in a single longhouse with one rival wife. She is in a sprawling palace compound, a complex and often lethal world of eunuchs, guards, and competing factions of women. Her value is tied entirely to her beauty, her ability to produce a male heir, and her skill in navigating the intricate politics of the court. While a frilla in Norway might have a slim chance of her son inheriting property, a concubine in Cordoba who bore the caliph a son could see him become the most powerful ruler in the Western world. But the fall was just as steep. If she failed to please her master or fell out of favor, she could be sold again, given away as a gift, or simply left to languish in obscurity. Her life was one of gilded captivity, a world away from the cold, damp longhouse, but just as precarious and even more disconnected from her origins. She became a ghost, her Gaelic past erased, her identity reforged in an Arab court, a footnote in the vast interconnected slave trade that the Vikings so brutally facilitated. Finally, we must ask how this institution died, or rather, how it changed. The arrival of Christianity in Scandinavia in the 10th and 11th centuries was the single greatest challenge to the frilla system. The church preached a new doctrine: one man, one wife, for life. Concubinage was a sin, adultery was a sin. The children of such unions were illegitimate in the eyes of God and the church. Officially, the practice was condemned. But a system that had defined elite Norse masculinity for centuries did not disappear overnight. The chieftains and kings who converted to Christianity did so for political reasons, but they did not readily abandon their social customs. For generations, there was a struggle between the old ways and the new faith. Concubinage continued, but it was driven into a gray area. It was no longer an open, institutionalized practice, but something less formal, though no less common. A powerful man would still keep mistresses, but they were not called friller in the same legal sense. Their children's status became even more precarious, as they now faced not only social stigma, but also religious condemnation. The church fought for the rights of the legitimate wife and her children, using control over marriage, inheritance, and salvation as its weapons. Over centuries, Christian monogamy did become the norm. But the deep-seated cultural idea that powerful men were entitled to sexual access to multiple women lingered, a shadow of the old world that refused to completely fade. The frilla as a legal category vanished, but the vulnerability of lower-status women to the whims of powerful men did not. It simply took on a new name. So, the story of the frilla is a story of layers. There is the layer of abduction and enslavement, then the layer of daily life, navigating the dangers of the household, then the layer of her children, born into a world that might reject or rarely elevate them. Then the economic layer, where her forced labor literally powered the Viking world. And finally, the religious layer, where a new faith tried to erase the practice but struggled against the ingrained culture of power. Each layer adds to the crushing weight of her existence, while a few, through luck or cunning, might have found a measure of security or seen their children rise. They were the exceptions that prove a devastating rule. The vast majority of these women lived and died in bondage, their names unrecorded, their graves unmarked, their stories silenced. Their legacy is the genetic echo in modern populations, and the chilling descriptions left by men who saw their suffering not as a tragedy, but as a simple, unremarkable fact of life.